There is a name most people have heard, but never truly met. They know he crossed a river. They know the walls fell. They know he won, but winning is not what made Joshua who he was. What made him was everything that happened before the winning. The 40 years of watching someone else lead, the silence of the desert, the weight of following Moses, a man who spoke to God face to face, and knowing that one day the mantle would fall on your shoulders. Can you imagine that kind of waiting? Not waiting for a job, not waiting for a phone call, waiting to become the man an entire nation would have to trust with their lives. Tonight, we open the book of Joshua together, not as a history lesson, not as a Sunday school story. We open it as people who are tired, as people who have waited a long time for something God promised, as people who have stood at the edge of rivers that looked impossible to cross. Because Joshua's story is not about a warrior who shook the world, it is about a man who almost didn't believe he could. And what God did with that man will stay with you long after this video ends. Stay with me. Before we go into the Jordan River, before the walls of Jericho, before any of the battles that would make Joshua's name echo through centuries, we have to go back to a moment most people skip. A moment in the desert, a moment of counting. Moses had sent 12 men to spy out the land of Canaan. 12 men who walked the same ground, saw the same cities, ate the same fruit from the same vines. 12 men who came back and told two completely different stories. 10 of them said, "The land is everything God promised, but we cannot take it. The people there are giants. We looked like grasshoppers next to them. We felt like grasshoppers next to them." That phrase has always stopped me. We felt like grasshoppers. Because that is not a military report, that is a confession of the soul. That is what happens when a man measures himself against his enemy before he has consulted his God. That is what happens when fear is given enough silence to become a verdict. Joshua and Caleb came back with the same eyes. They had seen the same giants, walked through the same fortified cities, felt the same heat under the same sun. But they came back and said something that must have sounded almost offensive to the other 10. "Let us go up at once. We are well able to overcome it." Not because the giants were smaller than they appeared, not because the cities were weaker than they looked, but because Joshua and Caleb had done something the others had not. They had placed God into the equation, and when you place God into the equation, the arithmetic of fear stops making sense. Now here is what I want you to sit with for a moment. Joshua was not rewarded immediately for that faith. He went back into the desert with everyone else. When the people heard the report of the 10 fearful spies and wept through the night and cried out that they wished they had died in Egypt, God's anger burned, and he declared that this generation would not enter the promised land. 40 years in the wilderness, 1 year for every day the spies had walked the land. Joshua heard that sentence too. He was included in that 40 years. A man who had believed correctly, walking in circles with people who had believed wrongly. A man who had seen clearly, waiting in the same desert as those who had refused to see. There is something in that detail that I find quietly devastating. Faithfulness does not always produce immediate reward. Clarity does not always produce immediate change. Sometimes the man who sees the truth has to sit beside the man who denied it, and wait, and keep his spirit intact while waiting, and not grow bitter, and not begin to agree with the fear around him just because the fear is loud and the waiting is long. 40 years is a long time to hold on to something God said. Some of you watching tonight know exactly what I mean. You believed something, you stood on a promise. You chose faith when everyone around you chose doubt. And yet here you are, still in the desert, still circling, still waiting for the Jordan to appear on the horizon. I am not going to tell you the waiting doesn't hurt, it does. Joshua knew it too, but there is something the desert does that the promised land cannot do. The desert strips you, it takes away every false confidence, every self-reliance, every belief that you can produce your own miracle. By the time Joshua stood at the edge of the Jordan River, ready to lead 2 million people into enemy territory, he was not the same young man who had run after Moses on the mountain. The desert had done its slow, invisible, necessary work. God does not waste the long seasons. He builds inside them the thing that the quick seasons cannot produce. He builds a man who has learned to wait on God instead of running ahead of him. He builds a leader who knows the difference between his own courage and the courage that comes from above. He builds Joshua, And when the time finally came, when Moses had gone up the mountain and laid down on the other side of eternity, God spoke to Joshua, not with thunder, not with fire, with something almost quiet. Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise. 3 words, now therefore arise. After 40 years in the wilderness, after watching, after waiting, after holding a promise that must have felt, on certain desert nights, like it belonged to someone else's life, now, therefore, arise. There is a sentence God spoke to Joshua that I want to stay inside for a while tonight. Because most people read it quickly, they nod at it, they put it on a coffee mug or a wall print and move on. But if you slow down and really listen to what God was saying, it changes the shape of the whole story. God said to Joshua, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Now on the surface that sounds like encouragement. And it is, but look closer at what God was actually doing. He was not complimenting Joshua on his strength, he was commanding it. Be strong, not, you are strong, not, I can see how strong you are. But, be strong, as in, you are going to have to choose this, as in, there will be moments when everything in your body wants to collapse, and in those moments, you are going to have to reach for something that does not come naturally. And then God said something even more interesting. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. He said it not once. He said it 4 times across the first chapter of Joshua, 4 times in the span of a few verses. I used to think that was for emphasis, poetic repetition, the kind of thing ancient writers did to make a point land harder. But I have come to believe something different. I think God said it 4 times because he knew Joshua would need to hear it 4 times. Not because Joshua was weak, but because what Joshua was about to face was genuinely terrifying. And God does not pretend otherwise. He does not say, this will be easy. He does not say, the enemies will run before you even show up. He does not say, you will not feel fear. He says, you will feel fear, and I need you to be strong anyway. That is a different kind of encouragement than what we often hear. It is not the encouragement that tells you the storm is not real. It is the encouragement that tells you the storm is real. And you are going to walk through it, and I will be there when you do. There is an honesty in God's words to Joshua that I find more comforting than any false promise ever could be. Because a God who pretends the Jordan is shallow when it is flooding is not a God I can trust with my life, but a God who says, I see the river, I see how high the water is, I see what is waiting on the other side, and I am telling you to go forward anyway, because I will be with you. That God I can follow into the dark. Now, let us talk about Joshua the man for a moment. Because we often flatten the heroes of Scripture into something almost inhuman, we forget that they woke up with doubts. We forget that they had nights of staring at the ceiling. We forget that faith, for them as for us, was not a feeling. It was a daily choice made against the grain of fear. Joshua had seen things that should have made courage easier. He had been in the tent of meeting when the presence of God descended as a cloud. He had stood close enough to Moses to understand what it looked like when a man truly walked with God. He had eaten manna every morning for 40 years, bread that appeared from nothing, proof renewed daily, that the God who provided yesterday would provide again today. And still, God told him 4 times not to be afraid. Which means that even a man who had seen all of that still had to fight for his courage every morning. That should do something for us. If Joshua, eyewitness to miracles, servant of Moses, carrier of the promise, still needed to be commanded toward courage, then the struggle you feel is not evidence that your faith is broken. It is evidence that you are human, that you are standing at the edge of something real, that the river in front of you is actually deep. The people who never feel fear are not the bravest people in the room. They are often the people who have not yet understood what is at stake. Joshua understood exactly what was at stake. 2 million people. An entire nation that had known nothing but wilderness. Children who had grown up under the open sky with no permanent home, no city, no walls to protect them at night. Elderly men and women who had outlived the generation of doubt and were now looking at him, this man who was not Moses, and trusting him to finish what Moses had started. That weight is not nothing. That weight would press on any honest man. And yet, he arose early in the morning. That detail is in the text. Joshua 3:1. Joshua rose early in the morning. He did not wait for the fear to pass before he got up. He did not stay in his tent until he felt ready. He did not call a meeting to discuss whether the timing was right. He rose early, because courage, at its most honest, is not the absence of fear. It is getting up before the fear has time to talk you out of it. The Jordan River was flooding. I want you to understand that this is not a poetic detail. It is not the kind of thing a writer adds to make the story feel more dramatic. The text says it plainly, almost casually, as if it wants you to feel the full weight of it without commentary. The Jordan overflows all its banks during the harvest season. Harvest season, the worst possible time to cross a river on foot. The water was fast, it was high, it was cold. And there were 2 million people standing on the bank. Men, women, children, elderly, livestock, carts, everything a nation carries when it moves, looking at that river and then looking at Joshua. And Joshua gave them an instruction that must have sounded, to human ears, almost absurd. He told the priests to pick up the Ark of the Covenant and walk into the water. Not, wait for the water to part and then walk through. Not, watch what God does and then follow. Walk into the water, first, while it is still flooding, while it is still moving, while there is no visible evidence that anything miraculous is about to happen. Put your feet in the river, and then see what God does. This is one of the most quietly radical moments in all of Scripture, because we have been taught, in many ways and by many voices, that God parts the water first and then we walk through. That He clears the path before we take the step. That faith means standing at the edge and watching the miracle appear before we commit our weight to it. But the Jordan does not work that way. The Jordan parts after the priest's feet touch the water. The miracle is released by the movement of faith, not preceded by it. The text is careful about this. It says that as soon as the soles of their feet touched the edge of the Jordan, the waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap. Not before, after, the step comes first, the miracle comes second. I have sat with that sequence for a long time, because it runs against every instinct in us. Every reasonable, cautious, self-protecting instinct we carry says, show me the miracle and then I will believe. Show me the parted water and then I will step. Give me the evidence and then I will move. God says something different. He says, move. And I will give you the evidence as you go. This is not recklessness. Joshua was not an impulsive man. 40 years in the desert had burned that out of him. This was something else entirely. This was a man who had learned it, through the long, slow school of the wilderness, that God's word is more reliable than what the eyes can see in the present moment. That the promise given yesterday is a more solid foundation than the flooding river visible today. And so the priests walked in, and the water stopped, and 2 million people crossed on dry ground. Now I want you to notice something that the text mentions almost in passing, as if it does not want to make too much of it but cannot quite leave it out. On the other side of the Jordan, Joshua set up 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, carried up from the middle of the riverbed while it was still dry. Heavy stones, river stones, the kind you cannot carry with one hand. And when the children asked, Joshua said, "What do these stones mean to you?" You shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. These stones shall be a memorial forever. A memorial, not a trophy, not a monument to Joshua's leadership, not a shrine to the military campaign that was about to begin. A memorial to the moment God made a way where there was no way. Because Joshua understood something that takes most of us decades to learn. You forget the miracles faster than you think you will. When you are standing in the moment of the miracle, you cannot imagine ever forgetting it. The feeling is too large, the memory too vivid, the evidence too concrete. You think, this I will carry forever. This I will never doubt. And then the next river appears. And the fear comes back just as loud as before. And the doubt returns just as heavy. And you stand at the edge of a new impossible thing, and somehow, somewhere in the back of your mind, the last miracle begins to blur at the edges. Begins to feel like it happened to a different version of you. Begins to feel, almost, like it might not have been as impossible as you remembered. This is why Joshua built the stones, not because God needed to be commemorated, but because the human heart needs physical reminders of spiritual realities. Because memory is fragile and faith is costly, and the enemy of our souls knows exactly when to remind us of what we are facing while making us forget what God has already done. Build your stones. Whatever form that takes in your life, write it down. Speak it aloud on the hard mornings. Keep the letters, the photographs, the journal entries from the seasons when God moved. Return to them when you are standing at the next flooding river and your courage is thin and the water looks impossibly high. Return to the stones and remember that the God who stopped the Jordan is the same God standing beside you now. He has not changed between your last miracle and this present fear. He has not grown tired, has not forgotten your name, has not handed your file to someone else. He is here, and the water can stop again. Jericho was shut up. That is exactly how the text describes it, not surrounded, not threatened, not weakened by the approach of 2 million Israelites camping on its doorstep. Shut up. The gates were closed. The walls were thick, the soldiers were inside. Nobody going out, nobody coming in. The city had pulled itself inward like a fist, and it was waiting. And God gave Joshua the strangest military strategy in the history of warfare. March around the city once a day for 6 days. 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets made of ram's horns, walking before the ark, no weapons drawn, no battle cries, no siege engines, no negotiation, just walking in silence around the walls once and then go back to camp. On the 7th day, march around 7 times. The priests blow the trumpets. The people shout, and the walls will fall. I want to sit in the silence of those 6 days for a moment, because we tend to rush past them to get to the falling walls. We want the collapse. We want the dramatic moment when stone and mortar give way and the impossible becomes suddenly, visibly, undeniably possible. We want day 7, but God made them live through days 1 through 6 first. Day 1. They marched. The walls did not move, they went back to camp. Day 2. They marched. The walls did not move, they went back to camp. Day 3. The same. Day 4. The same. Day 5. The same. Day 6. The same. 6 days of doing what God said and seeing nothing change. Can you feel the weight of that? Not the weight of one difficult day, but the accumulated weight of 6 mornings of waking up and choosing to believe the instruction again. 6 afternoons of marching in silence past walls that showed no sign of cracking. 6 evenings of returning to camp with nothing to show for the obedience except the obedience itself. I wonder what the conversations were like around the fires at night. I wonder if anyone said, quietly, to the person sitting next to them, "How much longer do you think we do this?" I wonder if the doubt crept in not as a loud accusation, but as a reasonable question, as the kind of gentle erosion that long, apparently fruitless obedience always produces in honest hearts. And still they rose the next morning, and still they march. There is a kind of faith that is easy to celebrate because it produces visible results quickly. The prayer answered by morning, the provision that arrives before the rent is due, the diagnosis that reverses in a week. We tell those stories gladly and rightly, because they are true and they are beautiful and they deserve to be told. But there is another kind of faith that rarely gets its own chapter. The faith that keeps marching on day 4 when nothing has changed. The faith that rises on day 5 without any new evidence. The faith that has stopped waiting for the feeling of certainty and has simply decided that if God said it, then the walls will fall. Even if they have not fallen yet, even if they show no sign of falling. Even if every rational observer looking at those walls would say, "This is not working." That faith is rarer and harder and, I believe, more precious. Because it is built from something the quick miracles cannot produce. It is built from the accumulated decision, made again and again across days of silence, to trust a God you cannot currently see doing anything. Joshua had that faith. And he transferred it to the people around him, not through speeches, not through theological argument, through behavior. Through showing up every morning and leading the march. Through walking past the walls on day 3 and day 4 and day 5 without breaking stride, without calling a council, without suggesting that maybe they had misheard God's instructions and perhaps a different approach would be more productive. He walked, and they walked behind him. This is what real leadership looks like in the kingdom of God, not the leader who always has a new idea when the old one seems to be failing. Not the leader who pivots every time the results are slow, but the leader who received a clear word from God and holds on to it past the point where holding on feels wise. Because he has decided that God's wisdom is a higher category than his own. Now, day 7 came. 7 times around the city, the trumpets blowing, defeat marching. And then Joshua spoke to the people words that I find remarkable in their timing. Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Past tense, has given, not. Shout and maybe the walls will fall. Not. Shout and we will see what happens, but. The Lord has given you the city. Down, finished, settled. Before the first stone moved, Joshua spoke about the victory as if it had already occurred, because in the economy of God, it had. The moment God speaks a thing, it is as certain as if it has already happened. The only variable is time. The only question is whether we will hold on to the word long enough to see time catch up with the promise. And the people shouted, and the walls fell flat. Every wall, all the way around, flat, not cracked, not partially collapsed, flat, as if something from beneath had simply removed the ground they stood on. As if the stone itself had decided that continuing to stand was no longer an option. 2 million people standing outside a city that had been impenetrable the day before. Now walking straight in, no siege, no casualties from scaling walls. No weeks of waiting out a starving population. Straight in, because they marched when God said march, and shouted when God said shout, and trusted when trust felt like foolishness. And the city had no answer for that kind of obedience. It never does. There is a woman in the walls of Jericho that I cannot walk past tonight without stopping. Her name was Rahab, and she is one of the most quietly astonishing figures in the entire Old Testament. Not because of her past, not in spite of it either, but because of what she saw, and what she chose to do with what she saw. When everyone around her chose differently, she was not an Israelite. She had not grown up on manna and miracle. She had not crossed the Red Sea, or stood at the foot of Sinai, or heard the voice of Moses echoing across the desert. She had none of the advantages that the people of God had accumulated across 40 years of supernatural provision. What she had was a window, a house built into the wall of Jericho. And through that window she had watched, she had listened, she had paid attention to the stories that traveled across borders the way stories always do. Quietly, carried in the mouths of traders and travelers and people passing through. And what she heard changed everything about how she saw the world. She had heard about the Red Sea, she had heard what God did to the armies of Egypt, she had heard about Sihon and Og, the kings of the Amorites, who had stood against Israel and been utterly destroyed, and she had drawn a conclusion that the leaders of Jericho, sitting behind their thick walls, apparently could not bring themselves to draw. She said to the 2 spies Joshua had sent, I know that the Lord has given you this land. Our hearts melted in fear because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Read that slowly. A woman in Jericho, a city that was actively preparing to resist Israel, had already concluded that resistance was meaningless. Not because she had no courage, but because she had clarity. Because she had taken the evidence available to everyone in that region and followed it honestly to where it actually pointed. The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. That is a theological statement of enormous precision. It is not, your God seems powerful. It is not, your God has impressive military results. It is, your God is the God, the only one, the real one, the one before whom every other claim to divinity is simply nose. Rahab saw that clearly. And then she made a choice. She hid the spies. She lied to the king's messengers about where they had gone. She let the spies down through her window by a scarlet cord and sent them safely into the hills, and she asked for one thing in return. Swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family, save our lives. That scarlet cord. She tied it in the window as the spies instructed, a signal, a mark, something visible that would tell the advancing army, this house is different. The people inside this house belong to a different story, and the city around them. And when the walls fell, flat, in every direction, Rahab's house in the wall stood. I do not know exactly how that works structurally. The text does not explain it, and I will not pretend to. What I know is that every wall fell. And one small section of that wall, with a scarlet cord in the window, did not, because God honors the faith that reaches toward him across every disadvantage. Rahab had no covenant background, no priestly lineage, no temple education, no years of watching God provide in the wilderness. She had a window and a willingness to believe what the evidence was plainly showing her. She had the courage to act on that belief at personal risk, in a city that would have called her a traitor for what she did. And God remembered her, not just in Jericho, not just in the immediate rescue of her family. In the genealogy of Jesus Christ, recorded in the first chapter of Matthew, in a list of names that traces the human lineage of the Son of God, Rahab is there, the woman from the wall of Jericho, the one with the scarlet cord in the window, named, remembered, woven into the most important family line in all of human history. That is not a small detail. That is God making a statement about who he pays attention to. He does not pay attention only to the people with the right background. He does not reserve his grace for those who grew up in the right family, attended the right gatherings, knew the right people. He pays attention to the honest heart, the one that looks at the available evidence and follows it truthfully. The one that reaches toward him from wherever it happens to be standing. Even if it is standing inside the walls of a city that is about to fall. Now I want to ask you something gently. What is the scarlet cord in your window, not as a metaphor to be analyzed, but as a real question about your life right now? What is the thing you have done, or refused to do, that marks your house as belonging to a different story in the world immediately around you? What is the visible sign of a quiet, private, costly decision to align yourself with God, when alignment was not the easy or popular choice? Because Rahab did not put the cord in the window after the walls fell. She put it there before, while the city was still standing. While the outcome was still, to any natural observer, uncertain. While it still cost something to be different from the people around her. That is when the cord went in the window. That is when faith becomes real. Not when the outcome is visible, but when it is not. Not when the walls have already fallen and everyone is celebrating, but when the walls are still thick and the army outside has done nothing but walk quietly around them for days on end, and the sensible thing would be to say, I made a mistake. I misjudged this. I should take the cord down before someone sees it. She left the cord in the window. And the walls fell. And her house stood. And her name is in the line that leads to Jesus. Do not take down your cord, whatever it costs you to leave it there. Leave it there. After Jericho, there was Ai, and I want to be honest with you about Ai tonight, because it is the chapter in Joshua's story that most teachers move through quickly, the chapter that makes us uncomfortable. The one that does not fit neatly into the narrative of triumph and forward momentum that we prefer. When we tell the story of Joshua, Ai was a small city, after Jericho. Mighty, walled, impenetrable Jericho, Ai must have looked almost manageable. The spies came back and told Joshua, do not send all the people. 2,000 or 3,000 men are enough. Do not weary all the people, for the people of Ai are few. And so Joshua sent 3,000 men, and they ran. The men of Ai struck down 36 Israelites and chased the rest from the city gate all the way down to the quarries. 36 men. Not a massacre by ancient military standards, but enough. Enough to make the hearts of the people melt and become like water. Enough to make Joshua fall on his face before the ark of the Lord and stay there until evening, with dust on his head, asking the question that defeat always produces in the honest soul. Why? Lord. Now God's answer was direct and, to our modern ears, jarring. There was sin in the camp. A man named Achan, from the tribe of Judah, had taken something from Jericho that God had explicitly commanded be left alone. A beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, a bar of gold, hidden under his tent, buried in the ground. Invisible to every human eye, visible to God, and because of that one hidden thing, buried under one man's tent, the entire community had lost its covering. The presence and protection that had made Jericho's walls fall flat had withdrawn. Not permanently, not vindictively, but with the quiet, serious integrity of the God who means what he says. I have sat with Achan's story for a long time, because Achan is not a monster. He is not a villain drawn in broad, dark strokes. He is a man who saw something beautiful in the wreckage of a conquered city and reached for it. A man who told himself, perhaps, that it was small, that nobody would know. That in the context of everything God had already given, this one thing, This beautiful robe, these coins. Surely God would not begrudge him this. He saw, he coveted, he took, he hid. The same sequence that has undone human beings since the garden. And I am not going to stand at a distance from Achan tonight and point. Because there is something in that sequence that most of us know from the inside. The moment of seeing something we know we should leave alone. The quick internal negotiation that follows. The decision to take it anyway, and then the hiding. Which is always more exhausting than we anticipated. Because hidden things have a weight to them that visible things do not. Achan's robe was under the ground, but it was pressing on everything above it. Now, here is what I want you to carry forward from Ai. Joshua did not give up after the defeat. He fell on his face, he grieved, he asked hard questions of God in the rawness of the moment. And then, when God answered, he got up, he dealt with what needed to be dealt with, as painful and costly as that was. And then he went back to Ai, with a different strategy this time, not the confidence of Jericho. Not the assumption that yesterday's victory automatically produces today's. But a careful, God-directed plan, an ambush, patient positioning. The kind of strategy that requires more discipline than a frontal assault because it requires waiting and hiding, while part of your army appears to retreat. Trusting that the retreat is itself the trapped, and Ai fell. Not the way Jericho fell. Not with trumpets and a shout, and walls collapsing under the weight of God's direct intervention, but with strategy and patience and the quiet, steady execution of a plan that God had given to a man who had been humble enough to ask after his defeat. Both kinds of victory are in this book. The miraculous and the methodical, the sudden and the slow. The walls that fall on their own and the cities that require an ambush. And Joshua was man enough, and wise enough, to receive both without demanding that God always work the same way twice. This is something the long years in the desert had built in him. The ability to receive God's instruction freshly, without overlaying it with what God did last time, without assuming that because the Jordan parted when the priests stepped in, Ai would fall the same way. Every new challenge required a new conversation with God, a new listening, a new willingness to follow an instruction that might look completely different from the last one. That flexibility, that refusal to poke God in a box built from yesterday's miracle, is one of the most underrated qualities in Joshua's leadership. And I think it is one of the most necessary qualities in the life of anyone who wants to walk with God over decades rather than just seasons. Because God is endlessly creative in how He works. And the person who insists that he must always work the way he worked before will miss Him when He comes differently, will stand at the edge of the next river waiting for a cloud and pillar of fire. Not realizing that this time the instruction is simply, take 12 men and set an ambush to the west of the city. Stay open, stay listening. Stay close enough to God that when He speaks in a different voice than before, you recognize it as His. If this conversation tonight has meant something to you, if Joshua's story has touched something in your own waiting, your own battles, your own hidden things that need to be brought into the light, I want to invite you to walk with this channel daily. Not because we have everything figured out, but because we are committed, every single day, to opening these ancient stories and finding in them the living word that speaks to real people living real lives in a world that is genuinely hard. Subscribe, come back tomorrow. Bring someone with you who needs to hear this. The journey through the book of Joshua is not finished yet. And neither is yours. Now, back to the story, because after Ai, something happened that is easy to miss but carries enormous weight. Joshua gathered all of Israel, every man, woman, child, and stranger traveling with them. He brought them to a valley between two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And he read to them every word of the law that Moses had written, every blessing, every warning, every covenant condition, every promise, all of it, out loud, to everyone. Why does that matter? Because Joshua understood that military victory without spiritual foundation is a structure built on sand. That you can defeat Jericho and Ai and every city in Canaan, and still lose the thing you were fighting for, if the people do not know who they are and whose they are and what they have been called to. He read the law before the campaign was finished, before all the enemies were defeated, before the land was fully distributed, before the work was done. He stopped in the middle of the battle and reminded the people of the covenant, because the battle, ultimately, was never just about territory. It was about a people becoming who God had always said they were. There is a moment in the sun that I have never been able to fully absorb. Not metaphorically, literally, in the sun, Joshua was in the middle of a battle. The Amorites were fleeing before Israel, rooted and running, and Joshua could see that the light was failing, that the sun was moving toward the horizon the way it always does, indifferent to human urgency, keeping its ancient schedule, regardless of what is happening below it. And Joshua prayed something that no reasonable person would pray. He prayed out loud, in front of all of Israel, and said, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stand still over the valley of Ajalon." And the text says, "The sun stood still, and the moon stopped. And the sun did not hurry to set for about a whole day." There has never been a day like it before or since. I am not going to try to explain the astronomy tonight. Smarter people than I am have spent lifetimes on that question and arrived at different conclusions, and I am comfortable leaving it in the category of things that are beyond my ability to fully understand but not beyond my ability to fully believe. What I want to stay with is not the mechanism. It is the audacity. Joshua prayed to stop the sun. Not, "Lord, give us strength to fight in the dark." Not, "Lord, let us finish the battle tomorrow," but, "Sun, stop. Right there. Hold, because I need more time, and I am asking the God who made you to simply pause you while we finish what we started." That prayer required a specific kind of faith that I think deserves its own name. It was not the faith of desperation, the prayer you pray when you have no other options and the crisis is so large that you reach for God simply because there is nothing else left to reach for. We have all prayed that prayer. It is a real prayer and God hears and honors it. But Joshua's prayer at Gibeon was something different. It was the faith of expectation. The prayer of a man who had walked with God long enough to have developed what I can only describe as a holy boldness, a confidence not in his own righteousness, but in the character of the God he served. A settled interior conviction that the God who stopped the Jordan and collapsed the walls of Jericho was not finished yet. That the same power that had been available on those days was available on this day too. And so he asked for the impossible. Not apologetically, not with a long preamble of qualifications and escape clauses, not, "Lord, if it be your will, and if it is not too much to ask, and I understand if the answer is no," but simply, "Sun, stand still." There is a directness in that prayer that moves me deeply. Because most of us have been so educated in our own smallness that we have forgotten how to ask God for large things. We have learned to manage our expectations so carefully, to protect ourselves so thoroughly from the disappointment of an answered prayer, that we have gradually stopped bringing our real requests to God and begun substituting smaller, safer, more manageable versions then instead. We want the sun to stop. We ask God to help us manage the darkness. We want the walls to fall. We ask God to help us feel better about living beside them. We want the Jordan to part. We ask God to help us be at peace with staying on this side. And God, who is the same God who heard Joshua at Gibeon, looks at those cautious, managed, self-protective prayers, and I wonder if he grieves a little. Not because he is demanding that we perform great faith for his entertainment, but because he knows what he is capable of. He knows what he has prepared. He knows what is available to the person who simply asks. "You have not because you ask not." That is not a verse about positive thinking. It is not a prosperity formula. It is a quiet, serious statement from the mouth of God about the gap between what he is willing to do and what we are willing to request. Joshua closed that gap. He stood in a battle that was going well but not finished, looked at a sun that was moving toward the horizon, and decided that the schedule of the universe was a negotiable detail and the purposes of God were at stake, and the sun agreed. Now I want to bring something else from this chapter of Joshua's life that tends to get overshadowed by the miracle of the standing sun. Before Gibeon, there was a deception. The Gibeonites were a people who lived nearby and who had heard what God had done to Jericho and Ai, and they were afraid. So they sent ambassadors to Joshua dressed in worn-out clothes, with cracked wineskins and dry, moldy bread, presenting themselves as travelers from a distant land who wanted to make a covenant of peace with Israel. Joshua looked at the evidence in front of him. The worn clothes, the old bread, the cracked wineskins. Everything that a person relying on their eyes would use to draw a conclusion. And the text says something that has stayed with me for years. The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not inquire of the Lord. They did not ask God. They looked, they evaluated, they used their own judgment, and their own judgment was wrong. The Gibeonites were not distant travelers, they were neighbors. And the covenant Joshua made with them bound Israel in ways that would create complications for generations. One failure to consult God. One moment of relying on what the eyes could see instead of what the Spirit could reveal. And the consequences echoed forward through time in ways Joshua could not have anticipated when he shook hands with men in worn-out sandals. I tell you this not to diminish Joshua, but because the text tells it, and the text tells it for a reason. Even the greatest men of God have the chapters they would rewrite. Even Joshua, who stopped the sun, had a morning when he forgot to ask, and that does not disqualify him. It does not erase Jericho, or the Jordan, or Gibeon. It makes him human in the most honest and useful way. It makes him the kind of man whose story we can actually inhabit rather than merely admire from a distance, because we all have our Gibeonite moments. The decision made quickly, confidently, on the basis of visible evidence, without pausing long enough to bring it to God, the handshake given before the prayer was prayed, the conclusion reached before the question was asked, and the slow, uncomfortable discovery, somewhere down the road, that what looked like worn sandals was actually something we did not fully understand. The remedy is always the same, not self-condemnation, not the kind of endless internal prosecution that mistakes guilt for holiness, but a return to the habit that should have been practiced in the first place. Ask God first, before the eyes deliver their verdict, before the evidence feels conclusive, before the reasonable conclusion presents itself as the only conclusion. In the space between the question and the answer, bring it to God. He sees what the eyes cannot, and he is never too busy to be consulted. Joshua was old. The text says it plainly, the way it said the Jordan was flooding. Without drama, without apology, Joshua was old and well advanced in years. The campaigns were largely finished, the land had been taken, distributed, divided among the tribes according to their inheritance. The noise of battle had quieted into something that resembled, for the first time in a very long time, ordinary life, people building houses, planting fields, raising children in places that had names and borders and belonged to them. And Joshua, who had spent the better part of a century in motion, leading, fighting, praying, deciding, carrying the weight of an entire nation on shoulders that had never once asked to be relieved of it. Joshua sat down and called the leaders together. Not to announce a new campaign, not to outline the next phase of the strategy, but to say something that old men who have lived honestly feel compelled to say before they go, the truth, not the official version, not the polished summary designed to leave everyone feeling confident and inspired, but the real thing, the thing that can only be said by someone who has nothing left to protect and nothing left to prove and nowhere left to go except home. He said, I am about to go the way of all the earth. That sentence, I am about to go the way of all the earth, there is no pretense in it, no euphemism, no softening of the edge. Joshua looked at the leaders of Israel and said plainly, I am dying. This is nearly finished for me, and before it is, I need to tell you what I know. And what he told them was not a battle plan, it was a warning about forgetting. He reminded them of everything God had done. The nations driven out, the land given, the promises kept. Not one word of all that God had spoken had failed, not one. Every single thing God had said he would do, he had done. The record was complete, the faithfulness was total. The track of God's reliability stretched from Egypt to this moment without a single gap. And then Joshua said, because all of this is true, choose this day whom you will serve, choose this day. Not, you have already chosen and the choice is permanent and there is nothing left to decide. But, choose, now, today, while you are standing here with the evidence of God's faithfulness spread out before you like a map of every miracle He has ever performed in your sight. Choose, because Joshua understood something that all the victories and all the miracles and all the years of walking with God had taught him about the human heart. The human heart does not choose once and then stay chosen, it chooses daily, it wanders daily, it is pulled daily toward whatever is nearest and loudest and most immediately gratifying. The gods of the nations that Joshua was warning them about were not primarily military threats at this point. They were comfort, familiarity, a religion of the people next door that required less and promised more and asked nothing difficult of anyone. The slow drift, the gradual accommodation, the barely perceptible movement away from the God who had done everything, toward the gods who had done nothing but were easier to live beside. Joshua had watched it happen his whole life. He had watched it in the desert when the people built a golden calf 40 days after hearing the voice of God at Sinai. He had watched it in the murmuring, the complaining, the constant pull back toward Egypt, toward the familiar misery of slavery, because at least in Egypt they knew what to expect. He had watched human beings choose the known suffering over the unknown promise more times than he could count. And now, at the end of his life, with everything God had promised delivered and distributed and settled, he looked at the next generation and saw the same drift beginning to form on the horizon, and so he said, "Choose." And then he said something that I think is the most personally revealing thing Joshua ever said publicly. He said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. As for me and my house, not. As for Israel, not. As for all of you gathered here, not. As for whoever agrees with this decision. But me and my house, this is what we have decided. This is the line we have drawn. Whatever you do with your own tents and your own families and your own quiet conversations around your own fires tonight. This is what we have chosen." There is a quietness in that statement that I find more powerful than a shout. It is not a political declaration. It is not a public performance of righteousness designed to pressure the crowd into compliance. It is an old man, at the end of a long life, telling the truth about where he stands. Not where he stood 40 years ago, not where he stood at the Jordan or at Jericho or at Gibeon, but where he stands now, today, in this moment, after everything, still here. Still choosing God. Still, I think about what it cost Joshua to still be standing there, at the end of his life, with that word still intact. To 40 years in the desert when it would have been easier to agree with the fear around him. The crossing of the Jordan when every natural instinct said wait for better conditions. The silence of the 6 days around Jericho when nothing visible was changing. The grief of Ai when the defeat had to be faced honestly before the victory could be recovered. The Gibeonite morning when he had trusted his eyes instead of asking God and paid the price for it across years of complicated consequence. All of it, and at the end of all of it, still choosing. That is not the faith of a man who never struggled. That is the faith of a man who struggled every single time and chose God anyway. That is the faith that does not burn bright and fast in a moment of spiritual emotion and then fade when the emotion passes. That is the faith that is built, slowly and at real cost, across decades of ordinary mornings when the choice was made quietly and without applause and often without any feeling of divine nearness at all. Just the choice, made again, because it is the right one. And I want to ask you tonight, not where you stood when you first believed, not the day you prayed your first prayer or felt God's presence for the first time or made your first public declaration of faith. Those days matter. I am not diminishing them, but where are you standing now? After the years that have passed since then, after the prayers that seemed to go unanswered, after the Jordan crossings that cost more than you expected and the Jerichos that required more patience than you thought you had and the eyes that revealed things about yourself you would rather not have seen. After all of it, where are you standing? Because Joshua's final word is not addressed to the people who have it all together. It is addressed to people who have lived long enough to be tired, long enough to have complicated histories with God, long enough to know that faith is not a feeling you maintain but a choice you keep making in the absence of the feeling. It is addressed to people like you, and the question it asks is simple. Not, have you been perfect? Not, have you never wandered? Not, can you look back across your life without finding a single Gibeonite morning where you trusted your eyes instead of asking God? Just this, today, who do you choose? Joshua died at 110 years old. The text gives him one final line, one last sentence after all the battles and the rivers and the walls and the sun standing still and the stones in the riverbed and the scarlet cord in the window and the old man's voice echoing across a valley between two mountains telling a nation to choose. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. That is his legacy, not the cities taken, not the military record, not the administrative achievement of distributing an entire land among 12 tribes without a civil war. Those things are real and they matter, but that is not how the text summarizes the man. It summarizes him by what happened in the people around him while he was alive. They served the Lord all the days of Joshua. A man's deepest legacy is not what he built, it is what he modeled. It is the thing that the people nearest to him kept doing because they had watched him do it faithfully for so long that it became, for them, the most natural thing in the world. The habit they inherited not through instruction, but through proximity. The choice they kept making because they had spent decades watching someone they trusted make it first. Joshua never wrote a book, he never composed a psalm, he never delivered a sermon that was recorded and passed down through the centuries under his name. What he left behind was a people who had watched a man choose God every morning for decades, and had been quietly changed by the watching. I want to sit with that for a moment before we close tonight, because we live in a world that measures legacy by visibility, by reach, by the size of the audience and the number of the followers and the weight of the accomplishments that can be listed and quantified and admired. We have been trained to believe that the life that matters is the life that is seen by many. That significance is a function of scale. Joshua stands at the end of his life as a quiet argument against all of that. His most important work was not done in public. It was done in the tent of meeting, where he stayed long after Moses had left. It was done in the desert, in the years of waiting that nobody celebrated and nobody recorded because nothing externally visible was happening. It was done in the private decision, made morning after morning across for decades of wilderness, to hold on to a promise that had not yet materialized, to keep the faith intact in the silence between the miracles, to remain the same man in the absence of visible results that he was in the presence of them. That is the work that produced everything else. The Jordan and Jericho and Gibeon and the standing sun were all downstream of something that happened in the quiet, in the unseen, in the long, unspectacular faithfulness that nobody applauded but God noticed. And I think that is the word tonight for some of you who have been walking faithfully, a season that feels invisible. Nobody is writing about your faithfulness right now. Nobody is recording the mornings you chose God when the darkness was still in the room. Nobody is taking note of the promises you have held on to past the point where holding on made sense to the people around you. Nobody is watching the prayers you pray in the early hours before anyone else is awake, the quiet, desperate, honest conversations with God that you have never told anyone about because they feel too raw and too real and too personal to share. God is watching, and He does not miss a single morning. The stones you have built in the riverbed of your own life, the memorials to moments when God made a way and you chose to remember instead of forgetting. Those stones have weight. They are doing something. Not always something you can see in the present moment, but something real, something cumulative, something that is building, slowly and invisibly, the kind of interior structure that does not collapse when the next flooding river appears on the horizon. You are becoming someone, not because of the spectacular moments, because of the ordinary ones, because of the quiet repeated chores, made in kitchens and cars and bedrooms and waiting rooms and hospital corridors and all the undramatic spaces where real life actually happens, to keep trusting a God who has not yet shown you the end of the story. Joshua never saw the full fruit of what he planted. He died before the complications came, before the generations that followed began to drift, before the judges were needed because the people forgot. He died with the land distributed and the covenant renewed and the people still choosing. He did not get to see everything, neither will you. None of us see the full arc of what our faithfulness produces. We plant things we will not harvest, we build things others will finish. We speak words that will not bear fruit until long after we have gone the way of all the earth. We make choices whose consequences travel forward through our children and our children's children, in ways we cannot trace and will never fully know. And that is not a tragedy, that is the nature of a life lived for something larger than itself. Joshua did not cross the Jordan for Joshua. He crossed it for the 2 million people standing behind him. He marched around Jericho for the nation that would live inside it after the walls fell. He built the stones in the riverbed for the children who would ask, decades later, what those stones meant, and would hear the answer, and would carry that answer into their own flooding rivers. He lived beyond himself, and that is the invitation tonight. Not to be Joshua. You are not Joshua. You are you, in your own specific life, with your own specific battles, and your own specific promises, and your own specific history with a God who has been more faithful to you than you have always been willing to acknowledge. But to live the way Joshua lived, with your face toward the promise even when the distance is long, with your feet in the river before the miracle appears, with the cord in the window while the walls are still standing, with your eyes open to what God has already done so that the memory of it becomes the courage for what comes next. And when the fear comes, because it will come, when the Jordan is flooding and the walls look solid and the sun is moving toward the horizon faster than you need it to, remember the words God spoke to one tired, faithful, ordinary man standing at the edge of an impossible river. Be strong, be courageous, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you, wherever you go, not wherever the path is clear, not wherever the outcome is guaranteed, not wherever the conditions are favorable and the enemy is weak and the miracle has already arrived. Wherever you go, that is the promise. It was enough for Joshua, it is enough for you. If this journey through the book of Joshua has spoken to something real in your life tonight, I want to ask you for one thing before you go, not applause, not performance. Something real. Subscribe to this channel. Come back tomorrow. Bring 5 people with you who are standing at their own impossible rivers right now and need to hear that the God who stopped the Jordan is still the same God today. Leave a comment below, not a polished one, a real one. Tell me where your Jordan is right now. Tell me what wall you have been marching around. Tell me what promise you have been holding on to in the silence between the miracles. I read them, everyone. And if you have a topic you want us to open together next time, tell me that too, because this conversation is not finished. The book of Joshua is behind us now, but the story of God walking with his people through impossible things, that story has no final chapter, not yet.